Hello, my name's Jonathan Lynn. I'm the Head of Communications and Media Relations at the IPCC. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. What is the IPCC? Well, we were set up nearly 30 years ago by two parts of the United Nations, the World Meteorological Organization and UN Environment, to tell governments what we know and what we don't know about the science that's related to climate change. Not only so what causes climate change and what we expect to happen with it, but also the impacts of climate change, the possible future risks and options for dealing with it. So now the IPCC is an organization of governments, like its name suggests, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what does the IPCC do? It mobilizes scientists from all over the world to assess scientific literature. In other words, the IPCC doesn't conduct its own research. It doesn't measure the weather or climate or anything like that. It looks at all the thousands and thousands of scientific papers that are published each year that have something to do with climate change, and it assesses them. It looks at all these papers and says, this is where the scientific community agrees, this is where there's disagreement, this is where there are information gaps and more research needs to be done. And every now and again, every 5, 6, 7 years, it provides a comprehensive assessment to policymakers, to governments. And by governments we mean national governments, local governments, cities, even smaller communities, to help them formulate policy that is relevant to climate change or affected by climate change. We also play a very important role in the international negotiations at the COP. Here we'll be speaking in Marrakesh at COP22. We're not part of those negotiations, we're not a party, those are the member states of the convention. But what we do is we provide them with the hard, robust scientific evidence so that they can formulate, so they can negotiate and reach an agreement that is based on sound science. Very important. So it's not just politics. Thanks to the work of the IPCC, we know the agreement here is based on science. Now, what is the IPCC doing now? If you think about a year ago when the world came together, the global community came together to reach the Paris Agreement on climate change, the reports of the IPCC, especially its latest one known as the Fifth Assessment Report, or AR5, which was completed in 2014, that was a very important input into those negotiations, and as a result the countries were able to have a science-based agreement to tackle climate change. Now what are we doing? Well, countries have come here this year to Marrakesh to look at ways of implementing the Paris Agreement. And last year they asked the IPCC to help them in various ways. So one way is when governments review their progress towards the goal of the Paris Agreement, which is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees while pursuing efforts to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. When they review their progress every 5 years on how they're doing to get there, they want to use the future reports of the IPCC as part of their what's called a global stocktake, taking stock of the progress they make. So that's one way they're helping. Now, I just mentioned that the goal of the Paris Agreement was to limit warming to well below 2 degrees, but pursuing efforts to 1.5 degrees. Because for some countries, they say even global warming of more than 1.5 degrees would be dangerous for us. For instance, many small island states are worried that global warming, that climate change, will lead to a rise in sea level that is so strong that their islands could be submerged. So countries like that, but many other countries too, said we should pursue efforts to 1.5 degrees. But at the same time that they put that into the Paris Agreement, they also realized that the scientific community doesn't have a comprehensive view of what 1.5 degree warming means. In our last big report that I mentioned before, the AR5, we had some information about 1.5 degrees, but not very much because, as I say, we don't do the research ourselves. We assess other people's research. And at the time that we did that report, there wasn't very much research that had been published on 1.5 degrees. So the COP last year asked the IPCC, we need very quickly a new report from you on what does 1.5 degrees mean, what would be the impacts of 1.5 degrees in terms of rising temperatures, sea level rise, extreme weather, impacts on food security, and so on and so on. What would that mean? And also, what would be the various ways that the world could get to limiting it to 1.5 degrees? What policies would we have to take in terms of limiting greenhouse gas emissions, which we know are the causes of global warming? What are the various policies we could take? So they asked the IPCC to produce that report by the year 2018, when there's going to be a first review of progress under the Paris Agreement, known as a facilitative dialogue. And they asked us to do that report, and the fact that they asked us to produce that report got the scientific community working very hard as well to produce research that we could include in our assessment. And to cut a long story short, we've started preparations on that report. We had a meeting a couple of weeks ago where we scientists and our member governments agreed the outlines of that report, so the table of contents and the structure, and now we're recruiting or looking for authors to take part in that report. So our member governments, our observer organizations, our Bureau of Elected Scientists can nominate authors, and then we need to make sure that we have a team of authors who have the requisite expertise to produce that report. So that's what we're doing at the moment. Well, we'll finish nominating the authors next month. Early next year we'll have the list of authors, and then they can start producing the report. So those are two of the ways that the IPCC is now working since the Paris Agreement. And I guess in general, the 1.5 degree report that I mentioned, plus our next big comprehensive assessment, the sixth assessment report, or AR6, which will be completed in 2022, is going to have a much bigger focus or emphasis on solutions, because we know that now the global community wants to look at the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So although there's still a lot of work to be done on the basic science, understanding how the cryosphere, how the melting of the ice caps and so on affects sea level rise. A lot of work needs to be done on the role of clouds in the climate system. A lot of work needs to be done on getting the regional and local detail of climate change impacts. At the moment we have a good picture of the global impacts, but we need to get much more information on local impacts, which of course is what is most relevant to policymakers. So apart from that basic science that continues, we're going to put a lot more work into looking at ways that basic science can help policymakers take the right actions in terms of, say, knowing early warning systems and things like that, looking at ways we can adapt to the impacts of climate change, looking at the policies we need to bring in, and we're going to be looking to involve, as we've already done before, but even more so now, bringing in economists and social scientists and political scientists who can tell us about the economics of climate change, about the decision-making process at the national and international level, and so on. So that's what the IPCC is doing at the moment. Now, I imagine that you're also interested to hear about how do we communicate about this, how do we educate people about it. Well, so formally we're an organisation of governments, and our main target audience is governments. We produce our reports formally to be delivered to governments, to ministers, prime ministers, presidents, and so on. But we know that because climate change is something that affects everybody in every country, we know there's huge interest in our work. And so one thing we're looking at doing at the moment, have been looking at and working on for some months now, is how can we improve the way we communicate our assessments, our reports, because some of them are very, very technical and very complicated, and of course we don't want to oversimplify or sensationalize the science that's in there, but we need to find a way of communicating it to people who are non-specialists. That could include the ministers, our policymakers, our main audience, but also civil society organizations, the general public, the media, school kids, whatever. So that's one very important piece of work that we're doing. And what we're trying to do, as I say, we don't want to take the scientific reports and dumb them down and sensationalize them and simplify them. What we want to do is to work with the scientists who write the reports to make sure that they think communications even while they're writing the report, so that they produce clear language and clear graphics that people, even non-specialists, can work with. So that's one thing. The other thing is, we know there's a big, that education is a very important part of this, and indeed education is part of the Paris Agreement. If you read the Paris Agreement in full, you'll see there's something called Article 12. It deals with education, and we're doing a lot of work with different organizations, civil society organizations, academies of science, and so on, how we can help take the IPCC material, the scientific material, and use that to produce materials for education, whether that's for school kids or high school students or university students. And in fact, there's a meeting going on today, not in Morocco, not in Marrakesh, but in the capital, Rabat, where some of our scientists who were here this week went to Rabat yesterday to take part in that meeting. It's a meeting of the French Academy of Sciences and the Moroccan Academy of Sciences, Academy Hassan Dern, and they are looking at ways of moving that forward, developing educational products. Initially they're looking at doing this for Africa, but if that works, then it will be spread out to be done globally, so Asia, Latin America, Europe, whatever. So that's where we are on education.